I never thought my sister's wedding day would be remembered for anything other than her radiant smile, the smell of flowers drifting through the air, and the sound of soft violin music filling the hall. But as I stood in the decorated church, beneath chandeliers that threw warm golden light across the polished floor, I carried inside me a truth too heavy to ignore. It was like a stone pressing against my ribs, every beat of my heart hammering against it, demanding to be released. The guests laughed and clinked glasses, the murmur of conversation swelling into waves. My sister Emily floated through the crowd in her white dress, surrounded by bridesmaids and relatives who adored her. She looked untouchable, glowing, like she belonged to a world of fairy tales. But I knew what was buried underneath the surface of all that beauty. The story really began weeks before, when I was cleaning out the attic of our family home. Dust floated in the shafts of sunlight as I opened old boxes, flipping through yellowed photo albums and stacks of forgotten papers. That was when I found the envelope. It was tucked between two thick books, as if someone had shoved it there in a hurry. My curiosity got the better of me. The envelope contained letters. At first, I thought they were harmless, just ordinary correspondence. But the handwriting was my sister's. And the words carved into me like a blade. They weren't letters to friends, or even to a lover her age. They were written to someone else, someone older, someone forbidden. The name signed at the bottom chilled me to my core. It was our mother's husband before Dad. A man I had grown up believing was long gone from our lives, erased like a ghost that had passed too quickly through the halls of our family story. Yet here was proof. He hadn't disappeared completely. Emily had found him. And worse, she had been writing to him for years. The letters spoke of secrets exchanged in hushed voices, of meetings hidden under the veil of night, and of a promise Emily made to keep him close, even as she stepped into her new life with another man. But there was one line that seared itself into my memory forever. "No matter what, you'll always be the one I truly belong to." I read it over and over, unable to believe. The wedding was weeks away, and she was writing love letters not to her fiancé, not to the man she was promising to build a future with, but to someone else, a man whose existence alone was enough to rip our family apart if the truth surfaced. At first, I told myself I would bury it, that it wasn't my place, that weddings were sacred, and no good would come from destroying hers. But the more I tried to push it aside, the more the words clawed at me in the dark. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time Emily smiled at me, every time she talked about her future, the memory of those letters burned hotter. The day before the wedding, I confronted her. Not directly, my courage failed me. Instead, I asked her how she felt about marriage, about committing herself to one man for life. She smiled and said, "It's everything I've ever wanted." Her words rang hollow in my ears, like glass cracking under too much pressure. By the morning of the wedding, my decision was sealed. I wasn't going to let her walk down that aisle with a lie tied to every step of her gown. But the weight of what I carried twisted in my chest. How could I be the one to ruin her day? How could I be the hand that pulled the thread and watched the entire fabric of our family unravel? The church filled quickly that morning, the air thick with perfume and the rustle of dresses. Guests whispered their excitement as the organ began to play. Emily appeared at the doors, her arm looped through our father's. She looked perfect, too perfect, like a painting that concealed cracks beneath the brushstrokes. I shifted in my seat, palms sweating, heart pounding. The truth throbbed inside me like a living thing. I saw the groom waiting at the altar, his eyes shining with hope, with love he believed was returned. He had no idea that the woman walking toward him carried another man's name pressed against her heart. The ceremony began. The priest's voice was warm, steady, echoing off the high arches of the church. Vows were spoken, words that promised eternity. Emily's voice trembled, not from nerves, but from the weight of her lies. I could see it in her eyes, even if no one else noticed. My chest tightened. This was the moment. I knew if I stayed silent, her secret would remain buried, poisoning everything it touched. But if I spoke, I would shatter the fragile glass world she had built, leaving nothing but shards behind. As the priest asked if anyone had reason these two should not be joined, silence fell across the church. It was the kind of silence that seemed to stretch forever, a held breath waiting for release. And then, before I could stop myself, I rose to my feet. All eyes turned to me. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might burst through my chest. My voice shook, but it carried through the hushed space. "There's something you need to know," I said. "Something that changes everything." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily's face drained of color, her bouquet trembling in her hands. And in that moment, the world stopped turning. The church was silent. The kind of silence that presses against the skin, heavy and suffocating. All eyes were on me, but I couldn't sit down now. My throat was dry, my hands trembled, yet the weight inside me was too strong to contain any longer. "I found letters," I said, my voice low but carrying. "Letters my sister wrote. They weren't for you." I nodded toward the groom. "They were for someone else." Whispers cut through the silence like sharp knives. The groom frowned, confusion written across his face. Emily's bouquet slipped slightly in her grip. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. I could feel my mother's eyes burning into me, but I pressed on. "They weren't just innocent letters. They were love letters. Promises. Declarations. And they weren't written to a stranger. They were written to—" My voice faltered. I looked down, forcing air into my lungs before I spoke the words that would rip the room in two. "To her stepfather," gasps erupted. The groom staggered back a step, as though the floor beneath him had shifted. A murmur surged through the guests, spreading like wildfire. Some stood in disbelief, others covered their mouths in shock. Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "That's not true," she whispered hoarsely, but her voice cracked with the weight of her denial. I felt no triumph, only sorrow. My legs threatened to buckle beneath me, but I stood firm. "I wish it weren't true. But I found the letters in the attic. I read them all. You promised him you'd never let go of him. Even now. Even today." The groom turned to Emily, his voice trembling. "Is this true?" She stammered, her face pale. Her lips moved, but the words tangled in her throat. Silence stretched, damning in itself. And then my mother stood. Her face was rigid, her eyes glistening. "Enough," she snapped. Her voice cut through the chaos like a whip. The crowd hushed instantly. "This is not the place, not the time." But the groom interrupted, his tone sharp, filled with hurt. "The truth doesn't care about timing." Emily broke then. Her sobs filled the church, raw and unrestrained. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she cried. "I was young, I was confused, and I never stopped." She stopped herself, covering her face with her hands, but it was too late. The words had escaped, the confession sealing the wound deeper. The groom's eyes hardened. He dropped the ring from his hand, and the tiny band clinked against the marble floor, rolling until it disappeared beneath a pew. He turned and walked away, each step echoing like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of their marriage that never was. The guests erupted in chaos, some shouting, some comforting, others leaving in stunned silence. My mother clutched Emily, begging her to stop talking, to stop making it worse, but Emily collapsed onto the floor, her white dress pulling around her like a broken dream. I stood frozen, unable to move. My truth had detonated like a bomb, and the debris rained down on everyone I loved. The hours after blurred together. The reception hall stood empty, the cake untouched, the champagne bottles unopened. Guests whispered in corners, while others fled the disaster entirely. The once joyous celebration had curdled into a scene of ruin. Later that night, in the quiet of our family home, the aftermath hit harder. Emily locked herself in her room, her sobs muffled behind the door. My mother sat in the kitchen, her head in her hands, her body shaking with silent tears. And I wandered, restless, as though the walls themselves rejected me. It wasn't until days later that the full story unfolded. My mother confessed, pieces at first, then the whole sordid truth. After divorcing her first husband, she had sworn she'd cut ties. But Emily, curious and rebellious, had sought him out in secret when she was older. What began as letters turned into meetings. What began as a forbidden curiosity turned into something darker, something twisted. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just Emily who had lied. It was my mother too, who had known, who had seen the signs but turned away, unwilling to admit what was happening under her nose. The family fractured. Relatives who once gathered for every holiday stopped calling. Friends turned their backs. And Emily, her once bright future dimmed into shadows. She moved away eventually, to escape the whispers, to hide from the shame that clung to her like a second skin. But the story didn't end there. Years later, I saw the groom again. His name was Michael. Time had etched lines into his face, but his eyes were steady, resolute. He told me that what happened at that church had nearly broken him. But it had also saved him, from a marriage built on lies, from a life entangled in a family's secrets. He had found someone else, someone true, and built a family of his own. Emily never married. The weight of what she had done followed her everywhere. She tried to start over, tried to bury her past, but no matter how far she ran, the truth was always there, like a shadow at her heels. And me, I often wondered if I did the right thing. If I had stayed silent, perhaps her life would look different. But silence would have been another lie. And lies had already poisoned us enough. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound of that ring hitting the floor. I still see Emily's face crumbling beneath the weight of exposure. I still feel the silence of the church before I spoke, and the storm that followed after. That day was supposed to be a beginning. Instead, it became an ending. An ending of innocence, of trust, of the fragile illusion we call family. But it was also the start of something else, the painful birth of truth. And though it left scars that would never heal, it also freed us, in its own brutal way. Because sometimes, the only way forward is through the fire. And that wedding day, that day was the fire that burnt everything down.